Welcome to today's African News Analysis. This is not noise. This is not rumor. This is verified political reality shaping Africa in real time. If you care about Africa, if you care about justice, and if you care about what power is doing behind closed doors, then you need to watch this to the end. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on your notification bell. Here, we break African politics with clarity, facts, and context, not emotion. Now, let's begin. Uganda was already tense long before the first protester stepped into the streets. The signs were there in whispers, in underground meetings, in hushed conversations across Kampala, Gulu, and Mbale. An election that many Ugandans believed was decided before a single vote was cast had reopened old wounds left by decades of political dominance, suppression, and fear. When the first protests broke out, they were not spontaneous. They were controlled, deliberate, and symbolic. Young Ugandans, many of whom had never known any leader other than Yoweri Museveni, flooded the streets with placards, chants, and raised fists. What shocked the government was not the size of the protests, but their boldness. This was no longer about opposition politicians. This was about a generation that felt trapped in time. Security forces responded swiftly. Tear gas, batons, arrests. The familiar script played out again. But this time, something was different. The anger did not retreat. Instead, it hardened. As images of protests circulated across Africa, another voice entered the conversation, unexpected, direct, and politically explosive. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso did not speak as a distant observer. He spoke as a symbol of a new African defiance that had been growing quietly but steadily. Traoré's message was not long, but it was sharp. He warned that African leaders who ignore the will of their people and cling to power through force should not assume they are untouchable. Though he never mentioned Museveni by name, the implication was unmistakable. Uganda was the headline. Museveni was the message. For Uganda's government, this was deeply uncomfortable. Museveni has ruled since 1986. Over the years, he transformed from a revolutionary hero into one of Africa's longest-serving leaders. Elections continued, but legitimacy increasingly came into question. Constitutional amendments removed term limits. Age limits were scrapped. Power became permanent. The protests reignited the debate Ugandans had been forced to suppress for years. When does stability become stagnation? And when does experience turn into entitlement? Traoré's warning resonated especially with Ugandan youths. Many saw him as proof that power could change hands, that leaders were not eternal, that fear could be broken. In social media posts and protest chants, his name began to appear, not as a foreign leader, but as a symbol of resistance. The Ugandan state media attempted to downplay the protests. They framed them as isolated incidents, driven by foreign influence and misguided youths. But the streets told a different story. Markets closed early. Universities became organizing centers. Even rural areas, once considered Museveni's stronghold, showed signs of unrest. Opposition figures, some previously sidelined or silenced, found renewed relevance. But this movement was not waiting for politicians to lead it. It was leaderless, decentralized, and unpredictable, exactly what authoritarian systems fear most. The military presence increased. Armored vehicles appeared near government buildings. Roadblocks multiplied. Arrests intensified. But repression only amplified international attention. Footage of unarmed protesters being beaten spread rapidly, drawing condemnation from human rights groups and foreign observers. Behind closed doors, Ugandan elites grew nervous. The warning from Traoré was not just rhetorical, it reflected a shifting continental mood. Across Africa, populations were questioning leaders who had overstayed their welcome. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. The idea that long-serving rulers were immune was collapsing. Museveni's government attempted damage control. Officials insisted Uganda's situation was unique and incomparable to military-led transitions elsewhere. They emphasized stability, security, and economic growth. But for many Ugandans, those arguments rang hollow in the face of unemployment, inflation, and political exclusion. The protests evolved. What began as election-related grievances expanded into broader demands: judicial independence, media freedom, police accountability, and constitutional reforms. The slogans changed. The anger deepened. Traoré's warning continued to echo, not because of its threat, but because of its symbolism. It represented a break from the old African political culture where leaders shielded one another regardless of domestic repression. His statement suggested that legitimacy, not longevity, was becoming the new currency of power. Museveni, a seasoned political survivor, understood the danger. He had weathered rebellions, sanctions, and international pressure before. But this moment felt different. The challenge was not armed insurgents. It was public consciousness. Attempts were made to divide the protesters, along ethnic lines, regional identities, and partisan affiliations. But the movement resisted fragmentation. The narrative was simple: Uganda belongs to its people, not to any one man. As protests continued, neighboring countries watched closely. Uganda has long been a regional power broker, involved in peacekeeping missions and security operations across East Africa. Instability in Uganda would have ripple effects far beyond its borders. Diplomatic language became cautious. Western allies urged restraint on all sides. African regional bodies avoided direct confrontation. But silence itself became a statement. Inside Uganda's corridors of power, the question was no longer whether the protests could be crushed, but what crushing them would cost. Economic confidence wavered. Investors hesitated. Tourism suffered. The image of Uganda as a stable anchor in East Africa began to crack. For Museveni, the dilemma was existential. Concessions could be seen as weakness. Repression could ignite further resistance. Ignoring the protests risked letting them grow uncontrollably. The youth, meanwhile, were no longer afraid. Fear had sustained the system for decades. Once broken, it could not be easily restored. Traoré's warning had done something subtle but profound: it reframed power. It reminded both rulers and citizens that authority flows from consent, not force. That no army, no constitution amended in bad faith, no manipulated election could permanently suppress collective will. Uganda stood at a crossroads. One path led to dialogue, reform, and a managed transition into a more inclusive political future. The other led to deeper repression, international isolation, and potential chaos. Museveni's legacy hung in the balance. He could be remembered as a liberation hero who knew when to let go, or as another leader who mistook control for destiny. The protests were no longer just about Uganda. They had become part of a continental reckoning, a question Africa was asking itself in real time: how long can power ignore the people before the people reclaim it? And as the streets of Uganda continued to pulse with defiance, one truth became impossible to suppress: the era of unquestioned rule in Africa was fading, and those who failed to see it risked being swept aside by history itself. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think African leaders are finally losing control of the streets, or will power once again silence the people? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's have a serious conversation.